As Katie mentioned, I'm a graphic designer. I'm based in New York, and I'm going to show a few digital publication projects that I've worked on over the last 5 years or so. And then I'm also going to talk about some recent research that I've been doing into creating new tools for designers in collaboration with cultural organizations. So I'm going to start with this first project. This is titled A Steady Pulse, Restaging Lucinda Child's 1963 through 78. And the Pew Center in Arts and Heritage in Philadelphia commissioned me to make it. And I worked on this in collaboration with Adam Lucas. So, as you know, Lucinda Childs was a choreographer, and she had created a series of dances in the late 60s and 70s that were really kind of crucial for her development as an artist. And the Pew Center has kind of a focus on investigating kind of modes of artistic practice. And in particular, they have a focus on the concepts of kind of restaging or reconstructions or reenactments of works from the past. And so in this case, they documented Lucinda Childs as she took 8 of her very early dance works and then restaged them using dancers from Philadelphia. So when you arrive at the publication, you see this cover, which has like an image of one of those early dance works. And as you scroll down, you see a kind of overview, a short text that provides an overview of all the content. So this publication kind of housed all of this material that kind of came out of these restagings. So there were videos of the original performances, as well as videos of the contemporary reenactments, and then a lot of ephemera, and then letters that she had sent to other people. And it kind of brings all of that together and provides a kind of vessel for it. So there's a kind of long form essay that Lucinda wrote to describe the process. But the kind of core of the site is really in the dances section. So if you click on the dances link here at the bottom of the page, it takes you into a kind of table of contents. And this lists out each of the dance titles. And you can kind of move your cursor along the titles. And as you do that, you'll see an image of each dance appear. And the design idea here was to place the text in a way that would kind of echo the movement of the dancers in her work. A lot of her work was about dancers moving along kind of arcs or lines. And so this is intended to be kind of evocative of that. And so if you navigate into one of the particular dance works, you can then find documentation of the restaging as a video. And then as you scroll down the page, there's additional material. So there's a section with kind of supplementary text, credits for the restagings, and sort of notes on the performance. And then underneath that, there's a section with archival media. And so, as I mentioned, the publication really pulls in all of this really great documentation. So photographs and scans of original scores that she made. And she would make these really incredible notational scores. And so this is the archive where all of that ephemera is kind of collected together. And she would create these notational scores that were kind of diagrams of the movement of the dancers. And so on this archive, you can filter by the different dances, and you can also filter by the type of ephemera. So, for example, looking at just the letters or poems that she sent, and then you can also look at some of those original scores that she created. So this is just scrolling through the archive, so you can see everything that was collected. So the scores were interesting because they're composed of many pages. And so we created this special slideshow element on the site where as you move your cursor from the left to right of the page, it actually indexes through the different pages. So you can kind of see the dance unfold forward or backwards or at different speeds and kind of understand it in a much better way. So that was a steady pulse, and this project was, really circulated around this project and all the kind of material that was created in the process. And it was actually built completely as HTML and CSS static pages. The center had made a request that this would be an archival publication, and so this launched about 5 years ago. And I think, because we worked with really kind of foundational web technologies, the site has been running, smoothly for about 5 years with very little maintenance, which I think is, an interesting thing to consider when you're starting off on one of these projects, considering kind of the life that it will have.
Andrew, it's Greg. I just want to pause for a second and let you know that the Zoom controls are actually showing up at the bottom of your slides.
Oh,
They were going to disappear, but if you have it, oh, there you go.
Now is that better?
Yeah, they're in the black area now, so that's better that they're not black.
Okay,
great. Thanks.
All right, thanks for letting me know. All right, so yeah, so let me just go to this this next project. This is another publication that was commissioned by the Pew Center. It's called In Terms of Performance, and it was a kind of lexicon where they made a list of these terms in performance, and then invited a series of contributors to write short reflections on each of the terms. And so this was initiated by the Pew Center, but it was done in collaboration with the Arts Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. And I think with with this project, what I was thinking about was, because it was composed of all of these very short texts, thinking about how someone would navigate through it and whether it would be possible to create more of a non-linear reading experience. So when you land on the site, you see a. So let me go back. So when you land on the site, you see on the right-hand side an introduction, and then on the left, you see a list of all of the terms that are part of the publication. And as you move your mouse, you can actually open up each one of the terms and see the contributions that are written in response to it. So expanding like the term duration, you can see the names of people who wrote in response to that. And then clicking into one of the texts, as you scroll through the text, images appear on the kind of left-hand side as you move vertically. And so there's this kind of play between the left and right sides of the screen and creating these kind of simultaneous moments where you can see text and image at the same time. A lot of times digital publications tend to be very linear in their presentation. You see text and then you see image one after the other. And so it was interesting to consider how to create these moments of kind of simultaneous reading where an image and a text would be in relationship to each other. The footnotes also would expand in line, kind of playing with that idea. And in the publication, as you would move, there was a series of links connecting each of the entries. So each entry at the end would be connected to several other entries. And at different points in the publication, some of the images would also be connected to other entries. So there was this kind of web of connections created by the editors that would allow you to kind of move in a very, very nonlinear and sort of emergent path through the publication. Now at the top of the screen, you'll see that there's this add to PDF button. And one of the features that we built for this was this idea of a kind of reader that you could create yourself. So as you're navigating through the site, if you come across an entry that you're interested in, you can add it to a PDF. And then that becomes collected together into a reader that will contain the entries that you've saved. And you can download that and it will collate it together for you into a single PDF. And that's kind of led to this great sort of life that this publication has had, where people use it as like a teaching tool. And it has also become a kind of exhibition that this is when it was installed at BAM. We built kind of a structure to present the publication in a space and put excerpts on the walls. And then this has gone on to kind of travel to different places. So in terms of performance, I think was a really interesting example of a kind of editorial process that started really in parallel with the design process. So this publication was originally intended as a book, but after doing the dance workbook, the Pew Center, I think, was really open to thinking about digital publishing. And so we started a conversation really early. And I think it was really nice the way that the editorial process and the design process could kind of inform each other. And I think the result is a publication where sort of the interactive form of the website and the kind of structure of the content really have a really beautiful relationship to each other. All right, so this last digital publication project I'm going to talk about is called Altered States. And this was commissioned by Jeremy Radke at the RISD Museum. I know he's part of this group. And it was an exhibition that was looking at a kind of revival in copperplate etching in late 19th century Paris. And this exhibition really focused on kind of process and techniques in addition to sort of this history of these etchings and like the artists who are making them. And when you open the publication, there's a cover that shows this video of one of the copper plate etchings being prepared and then used to make a print at RISD. And so you can sit here and you can actually watch the entire process from kind of start to finish and see a print being made. Just let it finish because it's really satisfying to see. And then on the publication, once you clicked, you would be taken down into a kind of table of contents. And so if in terms of performance was really about thinking about nonlinearity here, this publication really embraced the kind of long scroll of a web page. And so you would see a list of all of the essays that were part of the publication with the images that were part of them. And then as you would navigate, you would see a series of lines across the top of the screen. And these would actually indicate the start of each of the essays. And so thinking about kind of the proportional scale of these different texts and how to represent that through a kind of navigational system. So as you click the arrows on the left and right, you're actually kind of scrolled through the entire site to that particular essay. And then you can use those kind of bars to jump forward or backwards. And so it's thinking about like how you can move through a very long text in a way that feels, maybe similar to flipping through a book, where you get an overview or a sense of the scale of the content, even as you're navigating to a particular place. And then this publication was kind of notable because it had a lot of, let me go back, because it had a lot of kind of marginalia, really rich marginalia. And so, as you would move through the kind of text, I'm sorry, just fix this, you would see all of this material on the side, which would be like short notes and figures and videos that the RISD Museum actually commissioned of some of the techniques. So you can click on an image to enlarge it. And we had a little design gesture here where when you hover over one of these pieces in the margin, it would actually kind of indicate the place in the text that it was referring to. And so just thinking about this relationship between what's in the primary text and what's in this kind of surrounding or ancillary material. And all of these details about process and this glossary of terms are all collected together at the end. So I think, as a designer, also thinking about how the same material can be recontextualized or represented in different ways to kind of create different sorts of experiences within the same publication is really interesting. So, in thinking about publications, I think, as a designer, you really think about the kind of containers that you're working with, the structures that you're creating for content. So whether it's a linear form or a more nonlinear form, or whether, the sort of primary text gets emphasis, or whether it's about the emphasis of the surrounding material, and then really thinking about how a reader can kind of navigate through that, and what are the tools that you provide to the reader for navigating, and what kinds of reading experiences do those navigational tools create. I also think as a designer, thinking a lot about these little moments of interaction. So it could be a footnote that behaves in an interesting way, or a link that has a kind of surprising hover state, or a scroll that activates some part of the experience as you move through the page. And just thinking about each of these elements as an opportunity to add a kind of expressive element to a reading experience that subtly shifts the way a reader encounters material, and creates a kind of specificity to the reading experience that kind of sets the publication apart in a specific way. It's similar to like when you're designing a book or a printed exhibition catalog. You're thinking about the paper or the type of binding or the trim size, and each of those decisions communicates something to a reader. And I think it's the same with a digital publication. And then thinking about a publication within these broader networks, so how it can generate alternative formats like an exhibition or a PDF, and then how those can circulate in broader networks. And then thinking about how a publication can be accessible to different audiences in different ways. These are all things that I think are really interesting to think about in defining publications. So to shift gears a little bit, I think, in working on all of these digital publications, one thing that becomes very clear is that in order to get to a place where you can really think about these kind of design gestures, a lot of your work is actually focused on thinking about the tools and the process. So to do great design, it really requires really strong process, working with editors, and really great tools. So the tools can be content management systems or design tools, prototyping tools, and the process is, editorial workflows, how a publication gets defined, how the content gets produced, how it gets edited, how it gets tracked all throughout. And as a designer, I think working on a lot of projects, I've come to see that these often are really the element that you need to get right if you want to do a great kind of job on the design. And so in 2020, I co-founded with Irun Kong, another designer who's actually joining us on this chat, a research lab and consultancy called 908A. And the goal is to really carve out some space and time to think about these kind of questions. And so our goal is to create new design tools for the benefit of culture and humanity. And drawing on all of this experience that we've had working with cultural organizations and past clients, really thinking about how we can take the things we've learned from all of these really specific client projects and start to build better tools that enable better workflows. So thinking about both publications and identities as a starting point, one thing we've realized in working with museums in particular, but cultural organizations more broadly, is that they're really drawing from these rich collections and data sets, but then needing to communicate to audiences and engage with audiences across very diverse formats and channels. And this is just an image that kind of speaks to the way that a piece of content could become part of a newsletter, or on a label in a gallery, or on a poster. And I think designers have a unique vantage point where, on the one hand, we're seeing the people who are creating a lot of this knowledge, the curators, the editors, the registrars. And then on the other hand, you see the kind of formats that need to be produced in order to make that content accessible in different ways. And sometimes designers can be almost a bottleneck in this kind of process. And so As I mentioned, I think we're really thinking about this kind of knowledge production on one hand and the creation of design artifacts on the other, and thinking about how these can relate to each other. And thinking about tools and the kind of qualities of tools, and how a lot of our current tools tend to be heavily siloed and isolated from each other, very monolithic, frequently proprietary, non-collaborative sort of by default, and tend to be about solving kind of very short-term problems. And we're really interested in thinking about, can better tools rely more on open data that is transferable between applications, that's more modular, that's more open source, so it can be modified, that is inherently collaborative, so different people can contribute to a project sort of by default, and it's archival, so that the output and the work that goes into projects done on using these tools can last and can sort of have a positive benefit in the future. And so thinking about digital publications, I think we realized to some extent that that model is actually really useful, that you have a kind of content store, you have a sort of template, and then it generates an output. And that what's great about that when it works well is that you can have editors and designers kind of working together at the same time to converge on something, some kind of output in the end. And that actually we could start to think about this kind of model extending to a complete ecosystem, for lack of a better word, that you could have a kind of content store, a series of sort of layout engines, and then you could generate a series of different outputs. In the same way that you're generating a digital publication, you could also generate a gallery guide or a catalog or a label. And you can also imagine inputting different kinds of content sources. So it could be, it could be drawing from TMS, or it could be drawing from a database, or it could even be drawing from another institution. And so this research, with the support of the Knight Foundation at New Inc., we embarked on a research project, and we started this prototype with the RISD Museum. And we decided that we were going to focus on labels in particular. And we created a system that allows collection data to be collaboratively edited, and then is run through a layout engine that can then generate labels and other formats. So this is the prototype that we built. It's divided into two sections. On the top, you see the kind of content editing pane. Right now, we're using Google Docs to provide the collaborative editing, but that's something that can be swapped in and out. And then on the bottom pane, you see the different kind of design artifact outputs. So right now, you can see wall labels is selected, but also you could click on gallery guide and you would get a large print gallery guide. So the RISD Museum, is thinking a lot about accessibility, and something that they'd like to produce are these kind of large format gallery guides for visitors. And oftentimes that's something that's difficult with existing resources. And so this is a kind of tool that enables the content to be created once in one place, and then reconfigured and redeployed in different ways across different formats. So you'll see there's a button here that says sync. When you click that, it pulls the content from the top panel and updates the preview in the bottom panel. If you click PDF, it actually will generate a print-ready PDF for you that that contains the content. And this is still in an early stage of development, but it's fully functional. And I think that this kind of thinking, this thinking of generating sort of a body of content and then starting to do different things with it, is something we're really getting interested in with our work. So this is a project that we did for Future School, which is the project of the Korean Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennial. And for this project, we created Future School Online, which is a sort of community edited platform of content by program leaders and exhibitors and participants across about 50 kind of programs. Future School kind of creates this educational space within the context of the Venice Architecture Biennial. And so all of these people have contributed content to this platform. And now that all of this content is kind of gathered, we have images and short texts and questions and documents all networked together in one place. And our next step is to produce a printed version of it that will compile all of this content into a series of PDFs, which can then be collated together into a publication that will serve as a kind of archive of all of this activity that happened during the time that the biennial was open. And so this is the first project where we're thinking about sort of book length kind of output from these kinds of systems. And we're also working on another similar publication that will be published in the fall that is similar, going to be generated sort of automatically from a database of content. So really thinking about publishing at these different levels, from the level of a label and how the content gets created and the editorial process around a label and how that gets produced, all the way up to something like a book and how an archive of material can be output in different ways. So yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about our work, send us an email at everyone@908a.org. Happy to show more of what we've been doing and give you some demos, and would be really curious to kind of have a conversation. Like I said, my name is Andrew, and my collaborator, Yurun Kong, is also here. Happy to answer any kind of questions. And you can also visit our website, 908a.org. So thanks very much. And yeah, excited to hear kind of responses and questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. You want to quit the screen share so we can all see each other. Thank you. Thank you so much. Like breakneck tour through a lot of really fascinating projects. So there were a few questions in here. I'll just kind of maybe start from the top. Actually, Lauren, you maybe had one of the first questions, which was about PDFs. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure, and this is before the second half of your presentation where you were talking about some of these engines that you're building. But I was curious with the 3 digital publications that you talked about first, especially because they're so nonlinear, and with altered states, you have like these different panes of information across the page. I was wondering how you generated PDFs for those, and whether you created PDFs specially, or if you did have some kind of engine that was translating all of those into more of a linear format for people.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of different approaches that I've used. One approach is to manually and then just collate them together programmatically. With altered states, it actually uses print CSS to generate sort of a nice print version of it that can then be output as a PDF. So it essentially runs the web page with the print style sheet through a PDF output kind of thing. And with these newer projects, these book projects, there's a lot of like little problems to kind of solve along the way to really output something. And we've done some projects in the past kind of tackling some of those kind of issues. But yeah, we're primarily leaning on HTML and CSS kind of web technologies to generate PDFs.
If I could interject, I had a kind of follow-up question related directly to that. I was wondering about how you manage and deal with the tension and navigate the tension between that automation and the sort of desire for manual tweaking. It's something that I've seen in other projects. I experience every day in our own work at the Getty. But when you're outputting something with print CSS and it's coming out of the sort of automated templates, and people are like, but the line breaks, but the this, but the that, and always wanting to go in and sort of and wiggle. How do you navigate that and sort of a stakeholder and a kind of workflow direction?
That's a great question. I think if we fully solve that question, we probably will remove any need for designers altogether. But I will say that we have some very preliminary research around specifically the kind of line break and ragging question, because I think that's a really interesting, that often becomes like one of the primary things, in certain specific use cases. So I don't know. I wish there was a great answer to that question. I think, you try to come up with systems that are very forgiving. You can kind of think about similarly to how you think about a tool. The way that you design the tool creates opportunities for it to work well and also not work so well. And the people who are using your tool will often bend it to their needs in different ways. And I think as you do more projects, you start to anticipate better what those things will be. And as I'm sure you found, you kind of anticipate and work around a little bit in advance.
I have one follow-up question. I don't know if you stay connected with your clients after the project, but are you getting any reports or analytics about like the frequency of the use of the PDF downloads?
Yeah, actually, we were quite surprised. The PDF downloads are very popular. One of the projects, so for the PDF, let me speak to that in two ways. One, I meant to kind of talk about, but I think I skipped over it. I think thinking about sort of the longevity of a publication and sort of how it is going to be sort of maintained is a really important question to think about at the beginning. Certain projects that used really simple technology like HTML and CSS have had a great kind of natural sort of longevity because there's just less to worry about. Things that are more complicated, like a service to kind of collate PDFs, those usually require some active maintenance, So in that case, it's actually running as a service, like a microservice that is on a separate server. And so in that case, our server actually went down temporarily. And there were like multiple emails sent by different people who were actively relying on that feature for research or something and wondering when it was going to come back online. So I can't speak to specific numbers, but I do know that there's a dedicated fan base out there, maybe small, but they're committed.
The next one, a question from Suzanne about how you incorporate accessibility challenges in your design process. And you touched on that a little bit, although kind of more in the sense of making the content accessible in a variety of formats or interfaces. But I imagine this is more about, about accessibility in terms of, web standards and, screen reader, especially when you're thinking about potentially more interactive designs.
Yeah, I think there's always room for improvement there, to make a publication work better with those technologies. I think as a really good foundation, always making sure that, you have sufficient contrast, you have everything is semantically kind of programmed in the HTML. There's various like standards that W3 has for ensuring accessibility, like alt tags on images, things like that. So I think there's, it's sort of a spectrum, like you try to get as far as you can within the context of a particular project and make sure that you satisfy like that sort of good minimum set of requirements and then look for opportunities to improve. But yeah, I would say that that's something that, is, it's really important. And I think it's going to keep being very important in projects in the future.
There are a couple questions from Matt, and Matt, I might let you just speak to it because I think you raised a good one sort of early on, and I see there's another question that is somewhat around more to the question of labels and creating systems, and there are people who need to be participating in these systems who may not be have certain getting people on board with the workflow, getting people on board with a different way of working. So Matt, if you are willing, do you want to
Sure
pipe in?
Yeah, can I speak? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Hi. We a few years ago we did a very large label project where we tried very hard to incorporate using some sort of XML tagging to keep the labels in such a way that the data after editing for the wall labels could go back into the museum computer network database. But in that situation, we just couldn't get buy-in from the people writing the labels to have to work in any particular consistent manner, or, some were using Word, some were using text editors, and, we just couldn't get them to do it in a consistent way. But the other part of that is it seems like every time we've tried to do something like this, the text on the labels goes through so many changes in the process of getting it ready for the exhibit. And it's really particular to that exhibit. What you say about a piece of work isn't going to be the same from one exhibit to the next, based on the context of the exhibit. So how do you, make it worth setting up all of the database and everything if you're still going to have to do so many manual things to it each time?
I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about your experience with,
Sure.
similar kind of like project. It sounds like there's like a lot to learn there. I think, I mean, one thing I'll say is like in conversation with Sarah Gansblythe at the RISD Museum, one thing that was interesting that she mentioned was this idea of the labels, even if they're written for a particular exhibit, form this kind of amazing history of interpretation over time, and that's really valuable. And so I think even if they're very exhibition specific, there's, love to imagine a world where those things are saved and captured and entered into archives, because there's a lot to, I think that's about valuable history. But yeah, I think what the thing we've learned is that it's not enough to build the tool that just generates, but you really have to consider the entire kind of editorial workflow. And so I think we're stepping into that kind of process and really thinking, about how the tool kind of suggests a sort of best practice for, for kind of managing an editorial process, and trying to learn from like different institutions that have looked at this problem, like what works well and what doesn't. Because I think that's, yeah, like you say, I think that's really where, if the tool is not aligned with the way that the content is being generated, then, it ends up it doesn't end up facilitating the process. So yeah, I think it's a good question.
I was very struck in your conversation with your focus on the tools, right? Talking about the existing tools as siloed, monolithic, non-collaborative by default. I'm looking at some of the faces that are visible. I'm sure that none of that sounds familiar to anyone who is involved in some of our existing production channels. I'm curious, I mean, how do you approach that with a client without, talking about specific projects or anything, but if someone comes to you and is saying, okay, well, this is how we expect, how do you move that conversation along to point to different working models?
That's a good question. I don't know. What do you think, Rune?
I'm trying to process the question too.
I think I'll say this. I would say a small pilot project is a very effective tactic, because I think if, I think like, for example, in the case of the Pew Center, which, I don't, this was a really important part of the process for us. Like doing the dance workbook was like a smaller scale project. It was a kind of experiment, and it worked really well. And like, it sort of validated a bunch of sort of hypotheses that we had, to use startup kind of language. And so I think, I don't know, I think that's one way, is to sort of carve out a small space to kind of try things out. And then once people can experience to some extent a different way of doing things or some of the benefits, I think it's an easier conversation to have. One thing I want to mention is we're actually starting a pilot. I think I skipped over this, but we're actually starting a pilot right now with the Barnes Foundation. I know, I know some people who are part of the Barnes Foundation also are part of this group. So, I think these kind of pilots that we've been doing with institutions are a really good way to kind of test out the tools and sort of experience if they're working, and then also experience if the fits are compelling. And I think, so far it seems promising, but obviously there's more, there's more to do.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything that I can add is this is probably a very generic non-answer to non-answer, but like having an honest conversation about like whether this is the right way to do it, and then kind of getting into the detail about like why we think this particular approach is beneficial for like whatever purposes that they were having for the archival or the longevity of the project. And then it usually, I'd say it's I had like previous experiences where the clients were very reluctant to make changes to their existing workflows, But then whenever, like as Andrew was saying, where there was like sliver of improvement, like here and there, then that is actually pretty very enough to like trigger some bigger changes. So I think having an open conversation around that earlier in the process would be really beneficial.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to, I think that was actually sort of getting out in front of a question that I had, which was maybe going back more to, you know, with all of these, the sort of the authors, editors, then being part of the system matters, but thinking more specifically in terms of the book projects that you talked about, and you sort of alluded to there being much more of a sort of collaborative process in terms of, you know, and we talked about this a little bit in the pre-planning call. It's not like, here's the table of contents, Andrew, now like design something that will hold this, but that there was a concept that obviously they knew broadly what the contents were, but I imagine the approach that was taken, even in terms of the writing and editing, was very much informed by what form, you know, it was going to take, because of all of those, the idea of the interactions and the kind of like instantiation of the concepts of the book. And I guess maybe not to get too deep into like, you know, how that worked or how you structured that, like, you know, if there are things in just terms of like thinking about a different mindset to like approaching a project from the beginning, or certain skills or things that you feel like, especially for, you know, this group with, you know, that is, you know, publishers or, you know, editors, in thinking about how to think about approaching those projects, or if they're thinking, you know, or if they're thinking about starting them up themselves, like the ways that they could, you know, that the workflows might be really different from a traditional print publication, and kind of what your experiences were and what you learned from those processes.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that, you know, there's a number of assumptions that are built into sort of traditional kind of content structures that make a lot of sense for producing content in a particular like printed form, for example. And, you know, I think what has worked well in projects is where there's an opportunity to kind of start to sketch out or map out potential kind of containers and ways of connecting those containers to speak about it in a very abstract way really early on in the process, and sort of starting to talk about what is the relationship of things here, you know, what is the kind of hierarchy and emphasis on these different elements, you know, to start that conversation really early in the process, I think is really valuable, because it can help to provide actually some structure for the editorial process, and also it can kind of help to allocate resources, like knowing, for example, that within a particular structure, like in terms of performance, you know, sort of 3 images worked really well for those kind of scrolling essays. And so as you scrolled through the essay, there would be a sort of a series of like 3 images. So we knew from prototyping really early on that worked really well and made a really kind of compelling reading experience, even though the design was extremely bare bones at that point. And so that was really helpful, because then when they're going out and commissioning the pieces, they can actually say, you know, can you suggest like 3 works that you're interested in? And that also gave some scoping for rights and permissions and things like that. So I think it's sort of in that way, it's like the skill, I'd say, is the ability to kind of think abstractly about the content, you know, to really think about it on the level of what is the structure here? What is the structure of sort of boxes and lines that we're creating, and how are those connected to each other? And then as that gets sketched in, yeah, I think it actually makes editors' job easier and maybe more interesting. I think one theme that runs through these publications, and, you know, through, like, for example, the project with Future School, is that I think a digital kind of platform or publication offers a lot of opportunity to bring in other kinds of material that might not be part of like a print publication. So a lot of ephemera that's kind of research material that might not make it into a book is great to put into a digital publication. Or, you know, like the RISD Museum making those videos about process that were annotating the text. You know, I think those are the kind of some of the like opportunities, imagining these different ways of thinking about content than, you know, sort of your traditional kind of essay with you know, certain number of figures embedded in it. Those are really exciting. And then I think, you know, if you can build a structure to house those that actually kind of gives them life and puts them in context, then it kind of shows them off and like makes them a really essential part of the reading experience, which is good.
In your projects, sorry, jumping in with a question here.
Yeah.
And if anybody else wants to, please do. In some of these projects that have more, we could say, experimental organizations or tools like where you were scrolling through the different drawn pages of the dance.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any trouble with people not understanding how to use the tools or how to navigate the publications? And how have you navigated like how-tos or people's confusion about some of these? That was something that came up when we, now a while ago, did our study of different digital publications. There were a lot of people who were like, I guess there are really cool tools here, but I didn't know they were here, or I didn't know how to use them until you asked me questions about them in this study. So I'm just curious how you navigate that, especially with people who are accustomed to print books or print publications, art historical publications, or whatever else.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I think of it in terms of like there's a term, you know, sort of progressive enhancement, the idea that these kind of additional layers of interaction are not necessary to get to the content or to experience the content, but they add to it. I think that, you know, the sort of special features, I think that I've been interested in a lot of these digital publication projects, they all kind of fall into that category. They add something, or they introduce some additional element, but you can definitely navigate without knowing that they're there. So I think that's one level. You know, if you're creating kind of friction for a reader, I'm not sure that that's, you know, that's sort of the best as a designer. But I think that, you know, I wouldn't want to limit the kinds of things that one could add, because I think also people learn over time, and, you know, people's understanding of these interactive, you know, think about like the, you know, the early websites that looked like a neighborhood where you click on, you know, the house to go into the part of the website. Like we've moved quite far from that. Like we understand much better how to move through these kind of screen-based spaces. So I think that there's a you know, I think there's like potential to kind of lead that just a little bit and know that readers will like sort of understand over time.